Hey Bonnie, welcome back. So I figured I'd just go ahead and do a video of Ralph's grandson, just for the 3/4 turn portrait drawing. So pretty much like the last one that I did of Rolf, but just to recap everything, I do apologize if you can hear the fan going. It's a little noisy. But otherwise, I have the picture you sent me on my laptop off to the side here. So if you see me, kind of duck down to re-jostle the screen to keep it awake on me, that's kind of what's going on. Otherwise, I'm going to be using most of the same tools that I have been using up to this point. So mostly for this drawing, I'm going to be drawing on newsprint again, which is just, the large pad that I have available. It's pretty cheap paper, but it's pretty smooth as well, kind of unlike some of the heavily textured paper that you've been using. Likewise, I'm going to use two different types of charcoal today. So I've got, my charcoal pencil. You can see this one's fairly small, but I'll use this more toward the end for little things. I've also got 3 pieces of vine charcoal here, a couple different sizes, so I'll probably do the majority of the drawing, at least starting off with this medium guy. Probably use the bigger one for a little bit of shading, and then the little one once again for some little things here and there maybe. Otherwise, I've also got a couple different erasers as normal. I've got the kneaded eraser, which once again I can push and pull into different shapes. I've got a rubber eraser, and then I've got my 2 little bitty clicky erasers as well. So that's what I'm using. I've also got some paper towels at hand and ready. I've also got my little sanding block deal. I like to use this sometimes for cleaning the eraser or sharpening the vine charcoal, because it's a little soft, it's a little delicate going through a regular pencil sharpener. I've also got my maul stick for doing a little bit more of that kind of detail-y work. So let's go ahead and jump on into this. Like always, what we want to do to begin with is establish a couple of basic marks. So what I want to do is measure his general kind of measurements with my sighting and my angle sighting. So from my perception where I'm sitting, his face is about as tall as this piece is when I hold it outright, looking at the computer screen. But within that, I can make that measurement and say, well, the bottom is at his chin and the top is at the top of his, kind of the slope of his forehead there. And so likewise, I can see that his head it's going to be a little taller than that, but it's about the same height as it is wide. So I can start by making a few marks. So I can say, that's where I kind of want the top to be. And it's probably going to go up a little bit more from there once I start doing some angly things. But from there, I can say, well, let's make his bottom of his chin there. So once again, these 2 marks correspond to the length of my charcoal when held at at the arm's length in my perception. So from that, I can also say that, I'm measuring this mark that I made, these 2 marks I made here, from the corner of his chin to just above his nose. So his face is going to come off this way just slightly, a little bit extra over here. But from there, I can take that same distance, because it's basically the same as his head is going to be wide. And so I can make a mark there. Now I know that his, face needs to fall generally within this kind of frame and this kind of frame, okay? So from there, the other thing I want to do is I want to make a quick mark for just his hand, because his hand is such a prominent feature. And so once again, I'm holding my charcoal at arm's length, and I'm putting my thumb at basically where the cuff of his sleeve starts, at the low point there and measuring to the top of his index finger just above his nose, or just right at his nose. So I know that, generally speaking, I have that kind of distance, and so I can measure that against the height. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, and a little bit. Okay, so I want the kind of just past the edge of his nose is going to be there, but that's a good measuring point for me to make another series of marks that say his hand needs to fall within that space as well. So a lot of this early mark making is, once again, I'm holding the pencil or my mark making tool at arm's length against my image, and I'm making some rudimentary measurements. These will help with my proportion. So from there, what I want to do is I want to start looking at the angles. And I'm going to start with the leading edge of his face on the right side of his face, and because there's two pretty distinct angles there, and that will also help inform some of the hand placement. So once again, I'm holding it at my perception and holding it up to the edge of that angle, and I'm going to try to translate it as closely as I can. And I apologize if the marks are a little light right now. Once again, we're going to do some refining here in a bit. So and once again, his head's going to come up a little bit taller there. But I also want to, before I go to the back of the head, I like to make a few more establishing marks down in here. Because that'll help the placement of the back of the head in general. And so, in this sense, I also want to measure where the dip of his chin, or the main angle of his chin kind of falls. So, in that sense, it's roughly somewhere in there, because that space is about the same as, and I'm measuring from the edge of his chin on the leading edge to the curve of his jaw, and that corresponds to roughly the same distance as from the bottom of his chin to the curve of his cheek where he starts sloping back there. So I can take that and say, okay, it needs to fall within that space, and then I can once again make my angle, my general angle. You'll see sometimes this vine charcoal, when you get in the middle of it, it's a little harder than it is on the outside, so it doesn't mark quite as well. But from there, I also want to measure up to where his ear is going to begin as the jaw, comes upwards. So I want to look at it once again in relation to marks that I've already established. So I want it to be, it's going to be roughly about where his nose is, which is, once again, kind of about right there. So I want his ear to fall somewhere in that area. Now, there's going to be a little bit of adjustment that happens here as well, so, bear with me. But before I do that, I want to make a few other kind of establishing marks as well. So for instance, let's make a measurement for his nose. So once again, I'm measuring from the bottom of the chin to about where his nose is in my perception. And it's about 1/3 of this distance. So once again, it's about right at where this kind of crook is. And then from there, I also want to think about where his eye level is, his general eye level. So starting off from the chin, I can then say that it's gonna be probably somewhere about right there. And now I'm gonna make a general angle for his eye level. And from that, I can sit there and say, well, his nose needs to fall between those two marks. So I can come back and once again, I can make a general angle for his nose. And likewise, we'll go ahead and make a general idea of where his mouth placement's going to be. And it kind of follows a similar angle to his eye line somewhat. Now, once again, very rough to begin with, and we're going to refine it some more. But from that, let's also let's finish making the basic shape of the head in general. So, he's got a lot of hair going on, and so we're going to kind of look past some of the flyaways. And once again, I'm looking for basic shapes and angles that I see. And once again, thinking about that overall kind of placement that we see there. And once again, we're going to refine it some as we go. But we also want to pay attention to the fact that his ear kind of follows a similar general angle to the back part of his jaw there to some degree. But we are going to come off at a slightly different angle here. That's going to mimic the angle of the nose. And so we want to mimic, once again, that angle within that mark I made there. So the other thing is that his ear, where it dips in at the corner of the base of his skull there, is going to be about the same as his eye level. So we can come over and say, well, it needs to start somewhere in there. And then we can make a measurement and compare it to something else. So his ear needs to be about the same as from his chin to the base of his nose. So we can come over and we can say that the whole thing is going to be somewhere in these two marks here. So we can kind of fudge a few of those marks. Once again, there's a lot of back and forth. And from that, we can also say that his ear generally follows a pretty rectangular kind of form. And right off the back edge of his ear there, where his earlobe comes off, is where his neckline comes down as well. And we can see the rest of it also kind of dips in there. Now he's also got, a nice jacket on, so we'll make just a few little indications of that kind of stuff just to begin with. And now it's going to extend a little off over here. So once again, I can already tell that I need to extend the back of his head off just a little bit, and I'm probably going to need to make it a little bit taller too. But that's okay. I'm going to take a lot of these general marks that I've already made and just kind of extend them a little bit here and there. And once again, this will be a little bit more refined here in a minute. So let's also look at the fact that his nose has kind of a subtle bend in it. And once again, right now, I'm not making any major, kind of elements or anything. Instead, I'm just looking at basic shapes for the time being. And so I also want to establish where his general hairline is going to be, because that's going to dictate a few things as well. And he's got this kind of swooping hair, swooping bangs, if you will, that come just above his eye line. down like so. And so once again, we're going to refine some of these shapes a little bit more here in just a second. But let's also get a few establishing things in for his arm as well. I'm also looking at some of these folds in his jacket. We'll touch more on that in a minute. That's not super important. Detail-y kinds of things right now. But I also want to look at general angles in his arm and whatnot. And I also want to make a few basic measurements based on width and things. So I can see that between his chin and his arm, it's about the same distance between his nostril and the edge of his nose. So I can take that and come down and say, okay, well, the arm placement so far is pretty good. We're going to change that angle a little bit. Change that. Now, I want his arm to be, it's just slightly wider than from his chin to his nose. So I can go just a little bit and translate that. Now his shirt cuff kind of extends past his hand just a little bit. It's a little baggy. So once again, I'm not too concerned about a whole lot of stuff right now. I'm just trying to get basic shapes and proportions in the drawing thus far. And so likewise, there's a little bit of his sleeve back there. And from that, I'm going to generalize his hand into a single kind of shape right off the bat. And I'm kind of eyeballing a few things here and there. But generally speaking, we have a nice kind of hand. Now we can also say, I'm going to make a few general kind of marks for where his finger placement is going to be eventually. Now luckily this hand we don't see a whole lot of fingers, so we can kind of, you know, be a little bit more loose in that sense. But I'm also going to do his other hand because it's a nice part of the composition. And so once again, I'm looking at, I want to start by establishing the width, and I'm going to compare it to his other hand. So this distance here between where his finger and his thumb match and where his hand starts to bend in is about the same distance as where his other hand is going to be. So I can make that mark, and I want to see that, you know, his hand in the background starts from this little dip down here and kind of goes across a little bit and down, and this part comes off a little bit right there, and then his fingers kind of dip as he's clutching the chair in the background there. And so I can make just a few indications real fast of where I think that's gonna be, and then his thumb, I need to move his thumb up just a little bit. And there we go. So we have a general idea. Now let's also, just because this hand's a little more complicated, I'm gonna lay just a few more indication lines in there. So I wanna compare the length of each finger to, say, the width of his nose, and generally speaking it's a little bit shorter. I can come in and make a mark there, and then I can say make a mark there, because there's a little bit more of his middle finger kind of present, and then his ring finger kind of gets cut off there, and then we don't really see his pinky very much. There's a little bit of a bump, but otherwise, once again, general shapes just to begin with. Okay, so from that, I think I can start to lay in some main ideas of his face a little bit better. So I also want to think about the angle of that little fold just above the lips. I can't remember what they call that. As well as the angle of his mouth. And his mouth is kind of touching the corner of his thumb where his thumb is touching the face. And so from there we can come down just a little bit, and we can come up just a little bit, and we can make a few, once again, kind of general marks to indicate a few spaces there. Now, let's also look at the angle of his nose coming off this way. It's not as triangular as I started off with, and that's also going to dictate where that little fold comes in. But I also want to think about where the edge of his nose is, as well as where his eye starts to come into play here. And so that's also going to dictate a few other kind of things like this. So with that, I can now establish the kind of center line of the eye versus the top of the eye there. So once again, this is shifting everything down slightly, and then I can make those softer angles in the face that dip in for his cheek and whatnot. So his cheek kind of touches about where his finger is coming in there as well. Now I can also see slightly this little bit of a dip in his cheek coming around into the backside, and he's got a little bit of a shadow that comes down, so we'll just kind of make an indication of that. Now, from there, I also want to think about some of these softer elements that we see here and there as I'm establishing it. Now, we're going to do a little bit more refining, so I'm going to kind of wipe some of this down a little bit here in just a second, and then we'll kind of re-pick everything back out here and there. Because this is a little bit more of a clumsy tool or mark making tool than what we're going to really get into with some of the more refined kinds of lines that we're going to make. So he's kind of interesting in that he's got some pretty sharp angles, but he still has that kind of softness that you see with children's, kind of features as well. So it's a kind of an interesting mix of things that are happening there. So once again, I have his kind of eye line established. Let's start with the first eye over here, where we're kind of coming down into that dip and coming back around like so. I make just a few indications for where his pupils are going to be. And so from there, I have this other line that I've made right there, which is meant to be that kind of shadow that's dipping in on the opposite side of his nose here. And so let's start by first coming off of that just slightly. Now I'm also going to look at where his eye ends in relation to the corner of his jawline there. And it's pretty close, but not quite all the way there. So that's going to be kind of the end mark, if you will. Something in that line. And then you can kind of dip in a little bit. Now I want to keep my angle want to keep checking that, so I can see that his eye needs to come up a little bit. Remember, this is all a lot of back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. As we look at the image that we're referencing and looking at the drawing, etc., etc. And so once again, I want to kind of just make a general establishment of where his pupil's going to be, and we're going to refine that, or his iris, I guess I should say. And then we're going to refine that as we go as well. So once again, it looks a little strange right off the bat, but we're going to refine it somewhat and bring it out, bring it a little bit more to life, if you will. He's got some pretty thin eyebrows, and so those are going to be kind of an indication mark almost, more than anything. And when I start doing his hair a little bit later, when we start getting a little more refined, we're going to make it a little bit more loose and ethereal. So just seeing his face here as is, I can also tell that the back of his head is way too small right now. And I feel like that eye was just a little too big as well. So we're actually going to shift over slightly and kind of reestablish some things. So now I want to check some of my measurements against some of these marks I've already made. Okay, that's pretty good. Now let's say I'm measuring from here to the hairline. The hairline in this case, once again, that's his eyebrow. Everything's going to kind of shift over slightly. Then I'm going to measure from top of his eyebrow to top of his hair. So we can see I need to shift his hairline up slightly from there. It's pretty good. To come down just a little bit, and then likewise, there we go. Now I'm going to kind of establish his ear again a little bit better so that I have a better reference for the back and top of his head, because they're going to need to come out slightly as well. Here and there. Now I'm going to measure from the swoop of his bangs to the top of his head. Compare that to that distance. So we can see his head needs to come up a little higher. And then let's also say from here to the back of his head. So it needs to come back quite a bit further. But once again, back and forth, back and forth. So top of his head's a little bit flat, but it starts to dip down slightly before it goes into the full-blown curve at the back there. And then once again, that's kind of a subtle curve as well. He's got a little bit of a long hair in the back. So generally speaking, we have basic shape of his head down. So we can do something like that. Now the other part here is that I'm going to establish a few extra little things. In his shirt real fast that also will help us to see a few things a little better, make it look a little bit better, I should say, in terms of proportion. So once again, I'm not super hung up on crazy stuff just yet. I'm just looking at some basic shapes and angles, and the shirt I'm not as focused on, so I don't really need as much information there. But we'll do something kind of like that. Now let's also establish this hand a little bit better, because this one's fairly good for the time being as a rough kind of sketch. I am also looking at the general kind of quality of his face here and there. Alright, so once again, we're going to refine this a little bit more as we go, but I want to get some basic ideas kind of down before we really start to jump into anything too or much more refined. So that way we're kind of working on, or we have a good guide to go from, if you will. He's got some subtle angles in his hand there. His jacket kind of comes off just a little bit there as well. So I'm also looking at the kind of his arm resting on the chair there. Okay, so we have a fairly decent, you know, kind of rough breakdown, if you will, for starters. Now, I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna switch over to my smaller piece of vine because it's gonna give me a little bit better mark, and I'm gonna start to make some refining marks in general. So I'm gonna break out my handy maul stick because it's gonna let me kind of get down a little and finesse a little bit easier. Now, I'm still doing this fairly lightly. I don't want to pick anything out too hard just yet, but I'm just refining those kind of basic shapes that I've started to make here and there. And I'm starting with the nose because it's always a good starting place. It's one of the more difficult things to draw, in my opinion. I've noticed a lot of people have trouble with it. But this is where the 3/4 turn also comes in handy because it's a little bit more or a little bit less ambiguous than, say, trying to draw the nose from straight on, which presents a whole different level of challenge and whatnot. Now, he's got a little bit of a sharp point on the tip of his nose, so but it's not too sharp, but we want that to come through slightly. We want it to be a fair likeness of him. You know, he seems like a pretty cool kid just based on his kind of dashing demeanor in the picture. So we want that to come through. You know, don't want to do anybody any kind of injustice here either. So from there, I can see, you know, his lip dips down a little bit, but it's not super pronounced. A big portion of his top lip, that angle coming into his cheek there, is also the crease of the lip as well. It's not just, you know, the crease between his lips, not just, you know, the actual shape or anything. So we want to make sure to kind of keep that intact somewhat. And get a little bit of a dip down there as well. Alright, so from there, let's do his eyes. I always like to do the T of the face first when I'm starting to refine things, because that's where everyone's really going to be paying attention and everything like that. So I'm going to start with his right eye over here. And once again, I'm kind of following the basic shapes and angles I've already made, but we're just trying to kind of pick some things out here and there. Now, I can also see he's got this kind of subtle dip in his lower eyelid too, almost like he's kind of half squinting somewhat. So we want that to come through as well. And we can also see that his eyelashes form a little bit of a bridge across to that dip into his cheek there. So in that case, now, so I want to establish his eyebrow over here. Now it's not fully, you know, kind of intact. He's got very subtle eyebrows. We've also got a slight dip in his forehead there, coming in. And he's got some kind of messiness, some swooshiness coming through there, and we'll deal with that here in a little bit as well. All right, so I want to make one more establishing measurement real fast. So pretty close. I think we're going to shift his eye over just a skosh just a teeny tiny bit. And he's also got this kind of fold in his under eyelid over here as well. The other thing you want to watch is making the pupils and the irises similar in size. It's easy to make one a little bigger than the other. We also want to make sure it looks like he's looking in the direction that we see him in. And so once again, we'll refine that a little bit more. But just having an idea that he's kind of looking off this way. He's not looking at us as the viewer. He's kind of looking away from us slightly. So we can make a few little marks like that. Once again, he's got this kind of shadow from his under eyelid there, just slightly, and a little something coming off his cheek here and there. Now, from that, let's do his hand, this hand at least real quick, because it's touching the face, and that'll help us make a few more of these kind of ambiguous marks here and there, a little bit more clear. Okay. So something too you'll notice is that in the picture, there's this kind of line right here where his thumb is connecting to the rest of his hand, but you can see another subtle line coming down where his thumb is bent into the palm of his hand, and that kind of tapers off into darkness there a little bit. So we want to keep in mind some of those subtle things like that as we're working. Likewise, that bend comes in at kind of a sharp angle, and once again, we'll refine it a little bit more as we go. You'll notice I dipped his knuckle down just a little bit to give an indication of that tendon that kind of comes down there, which isn't super visible in the image, but it produces a slight shadow here and there. And I'm gonna you'll see, a few other little kind of indication marks I've made here and there, which are gonna indicate where certain shadows come in, things like that. All right, so. That being done, let's also establish his other eyebrow real fast. Okay. Looks pretty good. I'm also drawing this at kind of an angle so that you can see it on the camera a little better. So it might look a little strange right off the bat as well. Might look a little stranger than if I was drawing it straight on. But that's okay. It's a drawing, it's not a photograph. And if we wanted it to be 100% perfect, then we would just take a photograph. But that's not the point of what we're doing here. So, now in his jawline, he has this kind of sharp angle that's also kind of soft at the same time. And the bottom of his jaw kind of is a little rounded before going into the point of his chin somewhat. So once again, it's kind of sharp features yet childlike features at the same time. So we want to keep those kinds of things in mind. And a lot of this especially is going to settle off here in a bit when I do some of the shading on this as well. So just reestablishing his ear. And then some of the hair kind of flipping around his ear there. In this case, it's pretty good. Bad. Neck coming down into his jacket. Edge of his jacket. His arm in the background. We're going to cut that over just a little bit to make it less weird and ambiguous. And then making a few extra indications of some of those folds. So you can see that one needed to move up quite a bit so that we can do a few of these other guys that come in. Here and there. Now let's do his other hand real fast, and then we'll do a few marks on his hair, and then we'll start to refine and shade it. So we'll do few of these little folds in his hoodie or his jacket there. And I'm going to start on the underside of his hand, on his index finger, because he's got some subtle curve things that are happening as it bends around the chair. And you'll also notice that his finger ends here because we see his knuckles coming across and this curve right here. And so we want to keep that in mind as well, and that, you know, we're going to have some kind of shading indicators that take place in there. And likewise, we only really see his index finger in both of these. The rest of them, we just get these little indications of, you know, the fingers as they curve around and kind of dip behind one another. So we want to keep that in mind as well. Likewise, his ring finger over here just comes off of that second knuckle on his middle finger. It comes across, and we get a little bit of his pinky, and then his thumb there. And we'll make a little indication for his thumbnail there as well. Now, from that, we're going to establish that chair mark again, just for fun. You know, his sleeve kind of comes down and obscures some of that as well. So we're really only focusing on this kind of area. Now let's do a little bit with his hair as well. His hair is really dynamic, and that's a fun part about this portrait, is that hair. And so he's kind of got that little bit of a swoopiness, like it's been blown around by the wind, like he's, you know, been outside at play and whatnot. So now for his hair, I'm being a little bit more abstract. I'm not, you know, being super refined, because once again, once we start shading some of this, then that's going to dictate a lot of things about the hair in general. I also like to tell everyone that, you know, it's easy to overdo hair too much, because we're not really trying to render his hair every single little, you know, flyaway and thing that registers. Instead, we're trying to make an impression of his hair, you know, as we see it. So this kind of idea of his hair versus, you know, an actual literal, you know, every single strand that we see. We're just trying to, you know, kind of mimic the idea of his hair there. So I think we've got a pretty good likeness going on. You know, I can see a few things that need to change here and there, but generally speaking, we have a fairly decent likeness. So what I want to do now is I want to just start laying in some basic shading before I start to refine the line work. And this will allow me to kind of establish a few things without doing anything too crazy. And you'll notice that, you know, I'm not going to use the little one. I'm going to switch over to my big one, but I'm going to start very general. And I'm going to start in his hair because that's where a lot of the darker areas are. And right now, I'm just going to kind of make a few marks for general shadows that I see, and then we're gonna kind of blur those out somewhat, and then we'll come back into them. So I'm just kind of filling things in here and there. Like I said, we'll get a little darker with some of this stuff here in a minute. Sorry, I keep reaching over. I'm trying to make sure that the computer doesn't go to sleep on me and then I lose my reference material. So once again, like right now, right off the bat, I'm just making general kind of marks for where the general area of shading is going to be, and then we're going to refine it from there. So, you know, don't get too caught up right off the bat either on the shading of, oh, that's not in the right place, or it's too dark, or, you know, whatever. Because we're going to refine it. Just some things like that. Now I'm going to set that aside again, and now what I want to do, I'm just going to kind of use my fingers on this because it's a loose drawing, it's not super crazy. You know, I could use a paper towel, a blending stump, I could use a paintbrush for this, depending on what type of paper I'm working on. If I was doing this on toned paper, you know, this kind of is toned, but if I tone the paper first with charcoal, this would be the time, instead of laying this stuff down, I'd be erasing the highlights out and allowing the tone to be these kind of mid shadows and whatnot. But in this case, once again, because we're going to refine things, I'm going to erase into some of it, we're going to draw back into some of it. I'm not super worried about it being a little strange or off right now. Alright, so now what I want to do, now that my fingers are nice and dirty, I'm going to switch over to the pencil where I can have a little bit more refined line. And I'm going to start picking some of the drawing back out here and there since I've just kind of smudged it. And then we'll start to refine everything as well from that point on. So with this, you know, this is compressed versus the Vine charcoal, and the compressed is a lot darker, it's a lot less forgiving, so it doesn't smear as easy. So I want to be careful with how hard I'm pressing down on this. And I want to pay attention to those kind of dark areas that I see here and there. So I'm being, I want to be just kind of gentle, and I want to realize that, I'm only making these heavier, darker marks in places that really, really need it. It's kind of hard defining lines, if you will. So once again, a lot of this is also being soft, being subtle, where you need to be. And a little harder, more defined, where you need to be as well. All right. Okay. So once again, you can see I'm not touching everything with this, just some places, here and there. We're going to erase back out of some of this as well here in a little bit. So bear with me for just a few minutes. As we redefine some of his features. His eyebrow on this side is a lot less defined than the one on the other, which isn't really all that defined either. So I'm actually just gonna pretty much allow some of these kind of soft marks I've made previously be the eyebrow. We're gonna erase some of it here and there. But just generally, we're gonna let some of that stay. Now the other thing I want to do too real fast is I want to redefine a few things here and there with the shadowing, the shading, just to give me a little bit more something to work with here in a second. All right, so now you can see that as I'm using the pencil, you know, earlier I was being a little bit more gestural, I was being a little bit more angular, geometric, soft, not as well defined. You see though, as I'm refining with the actual pencil to get my more solid line, I'm being a little bit more fluid in my motions. And so that's something else to keep in mind as well. Now something else, I'm on the top of his hairline here. I feel like a lot of people kind of goof that up a little bit, and that once again we're thinking about it in terms of individual hairs coming in there, and we need to think about it more in terms of shadows and textures. And so it's kind of amorphous, if you will. You know, we see a few little hair flyaways here and there that come in, and we can make indications of those, but we don't want to go too far with them. And instead, we want to have the idea of hair, not every individual little hair that we see. So now, just picking his ear back out. And once again, he has some fairly strong features here and there. His ear being one of them. Okay. Now from there, I'm also going to come in and redefine his chin, but I'm not going to go all the way up into that. We're going to leave a little of that kind of off there. And in that case, I also want to increase the shadow in just that corner there slightly. And once again, we're going to erase some things here in a minute, pick some things back out. So you can see I'm kind of cleaning my hands off in some of these light areas because I want there to be a subtle shadow there, but not a whole lot here and there as well. And so I might also recommend that, you know, I know that you've been drawing on that, you know, like really specific drawing paper, you know, the heavily textured stuff. But I might suggest that you pick up a pad of newsprint just to try this kind of drawing, because it's a little bit softer, it's a little bit more ethereal. It doesn't have to be newsprint, it can be any smoother paper. Newsprint's just really cheap, so, you know, as you go through the pad, you know, if you mess up and everything, you know, who cares? It's a cheap pad. You just move to the next page, if you will. So it's a good source for learning and whatnot, or good material for learning, I should say. So before I do too much over there, let's pick his hand back out some before it gets lost to us. his other hand. Another thing on the hands is the fingers, they tend to kind of curve up and down on either end, so there's that little bit of a, you know, kind of skin paunch on the top that bunches up as the fingers curve. So it's another, you know, thing. We don't want these to just be straight lines or anything like that. You know, we want them to read as actual fingers do. All right. So once again, we're going to come back in and erase some things here and there in a minute before we finish off the shading. All right. And just a few little things from his little folds there. So let's pick out the rest of his jacket and everything real fast before we move on to his hair. It'll be a little bit more ethereal and a little bit more loose. Okay, almost there. All right, now let's make a few more lines in his hair just to emphasize some of that other kind of flowiness. Now the other thing you'll see here in a minute is that these lines made with the compressed charcoal stand up to rubbing them a lot better. So as I start to play with the shading, you know, these more defined, you know, kind of marks will, they won't disappear quite as easily as the marks that I made with the vine charcoal. And so once again, I'm just looking at the general flow. I'm not trying to be 100% accurate or anything like that. I'm just trying to give it a general feeling of how his hair kind of looks, how it flows, how it moves, whatever you want to call it. And we're gonna, you know, kind of up some of the shadowing here and there. We're gonna do some erasing back out of it, all that kind of fun stuff. So I think that's a pretty good for our line work. And then once again, from here, let's start to do a few, before I switch back to anything else, let's do a few kind of refining marks here and there with some of the vine or the compressed. He's got these really dark bands around the outside of his iris. And I'm going to use this in kind of a hatching motion for just a couple of these little deeper shadows that he has going on here and there. Not heavy. I'm not pushing down on this. I'm just letting it kind of glide across the paper surface. You'll notice that with the compressed, especially pencil or the compressed stick, that the harder you push on it, the darker the mark you're going to make, but also the harder it is to alter that line. The vine being super light, easy, you know, to manipulate, easy to kind of smudge out with your finger, all that kind of stuff. But the compressed line is a little bit more difficult in that regard. So you want to be careful how hard you're pressing down initially. You can always go back and push down a little harder here and there and, you know, up the shadow more, but it's a lot harder to take it away once it's there with the compressed. So it's just something to be careful of as you go. All right, I think now let's I'm still looking for some of those little shadows here and there that I might have missed. Once again, we're gonna work this a little bit back and forth here in a minute too, so bear with me just a bit. Kind of darkening a few of those areas here and there with a little bit heavier shadows. And whatnot. Almost there. And once again, we're gonna erase back out here in a second, and then we're gonna redefine a few things with our compressed charcoal again. So I'm just looking at general kind of shadowy areas. Alright, so let's switch over to the eraser real fast. first though, I'm gonna get a paper towel here. I'm gonna clean some of the excess charcoal off my hands, just so that I'm not making too much of a mess. And I'm mostly going to be using my kneaded eraser and then my two kind of smaller clicky erasers just to get into a few finer areas. So you might see me switch back and forth. I'm going to start with the kneaded eraser and kind of go around some of the general area and kind of redefine certain things. Now, what I like about this, and I know I've harped on it in the emails a lot, is that you can really mold it into all kinds of shapes, so you can get a nice fine crisp edge on it to get down into little nooks and crannies and things. And especially if you're using the paper that you tone first by putting the charcoal on the paper and smooth it out and then draw back into it, doing that with the vine charcoal to begin with, being that it's soft, you don't have to touch the kneaded eraser to the paper very hard, and so you can create a lot of those really subtle textures and things like that out of it. So and then from there, once again, kind of like this, you start kind of light and then you build your way up to dark and everything like that. So it can really help you do a lot of really interesting, detailed kind of marks and things like that without having to do a whole lot of extra work yourself. I mean, we could sit here with a number 2 pencil and make a photorealistic drawing, but we're going to be sitting there for hours and hours and hours really nitpicking every little thing and doing a lot of kind of back and forth and building the pencil lead up and all of that kind of stuff. So I always think it's more advantageous to work smarter, not harder, and any and everything that you can do, think of, use, what have you, to make your job a little bit easier is always a nice way to go. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Now, that being said, I'm going to add just a little bit more before I get too carried away, because I just noticed it. I'm going to add just a little bit more shading here and there on a few parts of his jacket. Inside some of those folds, things like that. Okay, so going back to the eraser here. Once again, I'm being careful to go around some of those darker marks I've made. I'm not too worried about hitting them with this because they'll stay intact, but I don't want to smudge too much because this thing will smudge. And in that case, sometimes you can get it loaded up with charcoal, like if I took it over this area, and I can bring it over here and kind of smudge with it. So you can actually do a lot of drawing with this eraser as well. I can't talk it up enough, to be honest. So I apologize if I'm kind of beating you over the head, with the kneaded eraser, but it's just a remarkable kind of tool to have. So I highly recommend it. They're cheap. I think a normal size one's maybe like $1 or $2. So and for some of this, the erasing that you see me doing, that's pretty much going to be it for some of these areas of the drawing. I might come back in and do a few little bitty things here and there, but generally speaking, this is a fairly nice way to kind of go about this. And so, you know, as I'm picking highlights out, I'm also thinking about the general shapes and things that I see here and there and trying to mimic some of those shapes with the eraser. Once again, working smarter, not harder. Now you also see that, like, I was using my main kind of fingers, you know, these three, to do a lot of the kind of blurring now or earlier, but I kept my pinky clean so that as I erase some of these things, I can take my clean pinky and kind of soften a few things here and there, and, you know, push them back, bring them back out, etc., etc. So that's something else to keep in mind. And I might pick a few other things back out of this here in a minute as well. Might re-up some of the shading here and there. Just little things like that. Some of this stuff where it got a little too dark too, the kneaded eraser is a little too subtle, so I'll switch over to the rubber one just to get a finer edge. Now the other thing I like to recommend people having a dusting brush. You usually see it in drafting materials, things like that. It's a brush to remove the pencil shavings without smearing too much of your drawing. So I've got one, but it's in the box over here and I don't want to have to dig it out right now, but it can help mitigate some of those things. So I think most of that's pretty good for the time being. I'm gonna darken some of it, but let's start redefining some of the highlights and its features here before we get too far gone. So the other thing too, I can erase a few little hair clumps out here and there. So hopefully you can kind of see that, and that doing work with the eraser that reads as hair and hair texture, things like that, without having to do a whole lot of crazy, kind of work, trying to redefine this and that and what have you. I also want to pay attention to the highlights. So he's got this main highlight that comes through here. And once again, I'm just picking out general things. and then we'll go back in. With the dark marking, and kind of redefine a few things here and there as well. All right, so let's look at his face in general. So this, at least to start with, I'm gonna make not so fine a point. Be a little bit more general and pick out the big areas of highlight. And then I'm going to go back in and with the rubber eraser, the little bitty one, here in a minute too, and kind of define a few extra little things here and there. The other thing too is that I can come in and soften some of these things up with the eraser as well, so that we have a little bit of a defining element, but like not super hard, anything like that. So you can see part of making this kind of stuff too, it's not necessarily having a hard line in the, or an actual hard line necessarily, but creating a hard edge through the shading, and then I erased part of it. So it's kind of a soft, hard edge, if you will. It's another one of the weird things that's a little hard about a lot of charcoal drawing and things like that in general is painting. All of these kinds of things are these weird kind of subtleties in the human form that are not easily defined all the time. Alright, so I'm going to switch over to my tiny rubber eraser. And I'm just going to make a few little marks here and there now. You'll notice too that the rubber eraser holds a lot more charcoal, and it starts to smudge more than the kneaded eraser, which the charcoal kind of gets folded into it all. And so that's why I like to have the little sandpaper block there to kind of help clean them off from time to time. I'm also adding those little highlights on his face, or his eyes, the gleam in his eyes, if you will. So from there, I think that's pretty nice. Give him a little bit more texture with the eraser in his hair over here. And we'll pick a little bit more out with the pencil. So I'm going to go back to the pencil just to end us off really quickly and make a few more kind of defining marks here and there. Up our shading a little bit, add a few little kind of detail-y elements, things along those lines. Now I'm just, once again, just kind of adding a little bit of deeper shading here and there. Redefining a few things here and there. just a few little things here and there. Alright, now let's finish them off here. I just tore the paper on his hair there. Yeah, that's the problem with newsprint. You gotta be careful. It's not very thick or good quality paper, so that is the one downside to it. Real fast. And bam. That's pretty much all there really is to it. Now, you know, once again, this is a fairly, you know, kind of ethereal drawing. It's not, you know, a super well rendered drawing. By any means, but it's a fairly decent likeness considering, you know, I just spent however little time doing this, you know, compared to like putting 60, 70 hours into it, where we could get down and really nitpicky and get super hyper real, hyper detailed, all of that kind of stuff. But, you know, I think it's a fairly decent likeness, generally speaking. You know, there are a few other general, you know, kind of little things that we could sit there and be super nitpicky over and all of that. But generally speaking, I think it turned out fairly good. So, you know, once again, as you're drawing, remember that we want to start by making basic marks for our proportions. And, you know, for like our proportions this way, that way, and then once again for all of our kind of defining shapes. And then we can start making those angle sighting marks where we're looking at general things like eye line, nose line, you know, placements and here and there, and then we can kind of round them off into, you know, kind of basic shapes, and then we begin to finesse from there. And so, you know, it's a lot of the work is really getting down those proportions, getting down, you know, our basic shapes and everything, so that once we go in and start to make those more well-defined marks, that we can be a little bit more fluid in them, and not super timid in them and everything like that, because we've already established things, so we're using those things as a guideline, and then we can be a little bit more confident on top, if you will. But that being said too, in the shading, once again, it's all a process of building from light to dark in drawing. Unless we tone the paper first, then we would use that for midtones, like what we see here. We would erase back out of that and then add the shadows back in. In this case, we're adding the shadows and allowing the paper to be the highlight. So in that case, it's we start kind of light and generally, and then like I did here and elsewhere, we just kind of build that back up here and there as we go. And so once again, it's easy. You can see I'm nitpicking a few things here and there, but you can nitpick your own drawing as much as you want, to pick out certain things, emphasize certain things, all kinds of stuff like that. But that's basically it, like our last one. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to seeing your version of the drawing, and I wish you the best of luck with it and have fun. But until next time, we'll see you then.